Very interesting perspective yesterday.
Go ahead.
That among all the Michigas, nobody's running
Nobody's running.
to Israel.
Right. Yeah,
Very interesting perspective.
I think that we had a pretty. Is that somebody for the class there? We had a pretty strong, intense conversation about this at the Yontif table. But anyway, yeah, the point being is that you have to look at people's actions, right? And then you can determine, good morning, welcome. You look at people's actions and you could determine what they really believe, right? People talk, but they don't necessarily, it's not necessarily backed up. That's the world we live in. There's a lot of chatter. Anyway, let's learn some Chassidus, some Kabbalah here. So just a reminder that beginning next week for the following 6 weeks, the Sunday morning class is going to be the world of Kabbalah. I'll be teaching the first 3 classes, and then we have Rabbi Weinberg who will be teaching. No, Rabbi Edelman will be teaching the next 3 classes. And some of you may have taken the course already. It's going to be from 10 o'clock till about 11:15. We'll try to do it in 75 minutes, but it's going to be very informative. Great introduction for those that are new to the world of Kabbalah and expanding one's notion for those that are somewhat versed. Doctor, we got a copy for you if you like.
It's a very good class.
So please sign up. It's free, but we'd like to know who's coming. We'll have bagels. We'll talk about that on Pesach. And other leavened items. Okay, so just to briefly recap the discourse, today's class, a rabbi once told me, never tell people, like when you're about to give a sermon, that it's going to be a long sermon, because then they shut down right away. So you never tell people it's going to be a difficult class. It's not going to be difficult. It's going to be easy, but it's going to be very deep and very profound. We're going to explore the final idea in this discourse, but let me give a context for the discourse first. I got it. Let's recap the discourse. It's a fairly easy recap. It goes like this. So the question that the Alter Rebbe poses in this discourse is, why do we find that the holiday of Passover is celebrated on the day that the miracle occurred? Right, the Jewish people, the striking of the firstborn took place at midnight. So on the Jewish calendar, that was the 15th of the month of Nisan. And on that very day, the Jewish people left Egypt, was the Exodus. Whereas during the miracle of Hanukkah, the Jewish people completed the battles on the 24th of the Hebrew month of Kislev, and they celebrated the holiday of Hanukkah begins on the 25th of Kislev. So there's a separation. And the same thing explicitly in the Megillah, when we talk about the story of Purim, it says that they battled on the 13th and they rested on the 14th, and in the city of Shushan, they battled on the 14th and rested on the 15th. So there's a question, why do we find that the other major miracles took place on 2 separate days? The miracle and the celebration take place on separate days, whereas on Passover, they take place on the same day. So to understand this, the Alter Rebbe introduced to us the concept of Mimali Kolaman and Soviv Kolaman. Mimali Kolaman means God as he is manifest within the structure of existence. Soviv Kolaman means God as he is manifest in an encompassing manner. It's not internalized. We elaborated at great length that in an orderly world, in a world of revelation, things need to be done in a systematic way. Revelation follows a flow. It follows a process from one level to the next level. each level receiving the amount of divine revelation as it is capable of receiving and as is necessary for it to fulfill its function. So maybe something is capable of receiving more divine light, but if it receives more divine light, it won't be able to function. It'll be overwhelmed. So therefore, it receives just the right amount of divine light. Conversely, something that we use the analogy of the 110 into the 220 or 220 into 110, right? Something that doesn't have as much capacity or something that has a lot of capacity and you don't give it enough, it's not going to be able to do its job. And by the way, we see this in material flow, right? At the end of the day, we tell the kids, you get what you get and you don't get upset, right? What that really means is that each of us have exactly what we need in this moment to fulfill our purpose on this world. If we needed more, we'd have more. If we needed less, we'd have less. So whatever we have is what we need, both in terms of our own person, our own skill set, our talents, our material needs, our relationships, everything that makes up my life is exactly tailor-made for me to fulfill my purpose here. The blessings, the challenges, it's all perfectly designed for me. And that's why I have what I have and you have what you have, because you get exactly what you need to fulfill your purpose. And that's true for human beings. It's true for inanimate life. It's true for animal life. It's true for vegetable life. It's true for spiritual life, for souls, angels, everything in the created world. And world, we mean the spiritual cosmos, the spiritual realms. Everything is tailor-made exactly for each and every creation to be able to fulfill its purpose. So that is God as he's manifest in creation in a confined and defined way for every single creation. That's called Mimali Kolaman, how God fills the world. Another little point on this is that this is also the dimension of God that we have a personal relationship with. So if you have a notion of a relationship with God, right, and 7+ billion human beings, those who are of a conscious faith and are in a personal relationship with God. Judaism believes in a personal God, right? So it's a personal relationship. The capacity that we have to have this personal relationship is because God fills existence. If God didn't fill existence, we wouldn't be able to have a relationship with him. Now, there are dimensions of God that we can have a relationship with. It's too transcendent. But all of that is on the Mimali Kalam and on the dimension of God that fills the earth. Now, within this personal relationship, there has to be a clean receptacle, a clean vessel to receive that light. Now, again, this has meaning on a number of levels, because I may not be conscious that I have exactly what I need in my life. So at that moment, you might say, I have a dirty vessel. My vessel is not clean, doesn't have clarity. But when I get clarity, then I suddenly, or let's put it this way, if I'm in a tenuous relationship with God, I'm frustrated, then I'm not really receiving what God has given me. Right? If I'm frustrated with the challenges that I have around me, and I'm angry at God or whatever, however that relationship shows up, then I'm not really receiving God's intention. So in order to be on the receiving end of God's intention, I have to have a clean vessel. I have to relate to those challenges as coming to me from God for a purpose. Now, take it up a level more spiritually. If I want to be in a relationship with God, and yet in the very same time I'm in this relationship with God, I'm doing things that God doesn't want, I'm violating God's instructions, then what kind of relationship is that? I'm not really in a relationship with God when I'm doing exactly what God doesn't want, right? You can't be in a relationship of fidelity when you're being unfaithful. It doesn't. You can call it in a relationship, but it's not really a relationship. It's a concoction of your mind. It's not real. The heart is dedicated to one, not to multiple, in that type of relationship. So all of that is memale kolam, in the dimension of God that fills the earth. Then you have God as he encompasses. In Hebrew, it's called sovev. He encircles, or to use other terms, makif. Makif means it's an encompassing, surrounding light. And the reason why it's surrounding is because it's too intense, it's too great to be internalized. Right? The reason why the first light can be manifest in a personal, internal way is because it's diminished. That's the disadvantage. The disadvantage is it's not as intense, it's not as high a revelation. But its advantage is that it's personal, it's accessible. The encompassing light is too intense, it's too great to be internalized. And since it's too great to be internalized, it shows up in its powerful, pure form, and it's there, and it's overwhelming, and it's powerful, and it's influential, but it's not personal. And again, on a human relationship level, there are dimensions to our beingness that are too intense for others to experience. And therefore, for the most part, we relate to others, even to spouses, through our faculties, intellect, emotion, action. These are all external expressions. They may be external expressions of a profound love, but they're external expressions. Moments of intimacy, which is the greatest connection that we can have in this physical world, are moments. They're not something that we are perpetual, because it's just, you can't function on that space, both physically and emotionally. It's just too intense. You can't function that way in a world that requires balance, right? If we're intended to get up in the morning and go to work, and by the way, if you operate only on an essential level, on this higher dimension, then you don't operate on the external dimension. But in this physical world, we need to eat. And we have other emotional needs and other intellectual needs that need to be met. So therefore, we can't only operate on an essential level, besides the fact that it's practically impossible within the human condition to be able to operate that way. But that's a little bit on a tangent. But on a spiritual level, God's manifestation of this encompassing light is not something that we get to experience on a regular level, because we're just simply not capable of internalizing it. Okay, so all that more or less makes sense on a very surface level. Okay, so now we're going to differentiate on that basis between the story of Hanukkah and Purim and Passover. The miracle, what is miracle? What is a miracle? A miracle is how God manifests himself within the world. The word in Hebrew for miracle is nes. Nes means something that is above. It's above the normal, right? That's why we call it a miracle. We operate on a certain dimension, and then something happens, we say, oh, that's a miracle. Why? Because it doesn't flow within the usual, right? And we discussed at length, there's a distinction between miracles within nature, versus miracles above nature. But miracle means that it's outside of the norm. And that's where God is showing up outside of the norm. Now, I'm gonna qualify the teaching here, because interesting enough, even though for the most part, the miracle of Hanukkah that is celebrated is the miracle of the oil and the fact that it burned for 8 days, even though it should have only burned for 1. But the core miracle of Hanukkah is actually the victory of the Maccabean army over the great Greek Syrian army. And in fact, if you look in the prayers that we say on Hanukkah, we almost do not mention the miracle of the candles at all, the oil at all, even though the celebration, the external celebration, is all about the oil, right? We light the menorah, we eat latkes, but the prayer is about the victory of the few over the many, the pure over the impure. And the reason for that is that the miracle of the oil, according to the teachings of Kabbalah, is actually a gift that God gave to the Maccabees as a result of their faith in being willing to go out to battle, in a battle that they should have lost. And they were victorious in the fact that they had that faith. God said, I'm going to match your faith with performing something. You are willing to be transcendent within your own experience. I'm willing to show you a miracle that's a transcendent miracle. But the core miracle of Hanukkah, if you think about it, what was the story that led up to it? It was this oppressing army and culture that wanted to eradicate the faith that the Jewish people had in God and their practice of Judaism, their study of Torah. And the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, rose up against this culture and fought against it and ultimately were victorious. That's really the story. That's the history of the story of Hanukkah. Yes, it culminated with the returning to Jerusalem and cleaning up the temple and finding the flask of oil and the miracle of the oil. But the real story is the story of the victory of the few over the many. Now, if we look at that battle, I would say, if we were experiencing that battle today, it might be seen as, oh, wow, look how smart the Israelis are and the alliances that they made, that when I ran through 300 projectiles at them, they were able to knock it out of the sky. In other words, we're susceptible, even though, if you think about it for a half a second, the odds that, except for one of these projectiles, nobody got hurt. And even military experts say that it makes no sense, but you didn't hear that in the news, right? The news was, wow, the alliances, and even Jordan helped out, right? It was a crazy miracle. It was a miracle perhaps enclosed within nature, but it was a miracle. And if you look at the Hanukkah story, the victory of the few over the many, one could say the same thing. The Maccabean army they were super smart. And even though they were, according to one opinion, 5,000 against 60,000, they were victorious. They had better military strategy. They had maybe whatever it might have been. In other words, the point being is that the miracle was in some sense within nature. The story of Purim, for sure, is a story within nature, because there's nothing miraculous in any part of the story. It's only when you bring the whole story together that you see the miracle. Now, when God is manifesting himself within the normal flow of the world, even if it's a miracle, but it's within the flow of the world, we're not breaking nature, he's working within the structure of nature. So in that place, there can't be both the negative and the positive. You can't be in this personal relationship when at the same time, you're violating the relationship. In other words, either you're engaged in destroying the evil or you're celebrating the light. They can't coexist at the same time. Because in an orderly revelation, things happen in a process. So therefore, in the story of Hanukkah and the story of Purim, first they were victorious, first the miracle took place, and then they celebrated, then they experienced the revelation. But Pesach, something else happened. Something unique happened during the miracle of Passover. And that was that in the very same moment that God struck the Egyptian firstborn, he also preserved the Jewish firstborn. In the very same moment that there was an eradication of evil, there was an embrace of holiness. In the very same moment, in the very same place. We actually discussed this yesterday at the table. It's a very interesting notion that we were talking about Jews today who are antagonistic to the Jewish people or anti-Israel, whatever. In Egypt, there were Jews who were in the Jewish people lived in a place in Egypt called Goshen. That was where the Jewish community was. And especially once the plague started, according to the Midrash, the slavery ended. So some 10 months before the Exodus, they actually had stopped. They were no longer working. There were Jews who were in Egyptian homes on the eve of Passover. At the time that God had instructed them to sit around the Seder to be prepared for the Exodus, having witnessed all these miracles, there were Jews who were hanging around in Egyptian homes. And even those people, God saved. Those firstborns that were in those Egyptian homes, God saved them. So it's very disorderly, right? Something's going on here. God is finding the Egyptian firstborns and saving the Jewish firstborns and jumping over the homes of the Jews. In the very same moment, there's these two opposite things happening. That doesn't come from the function of orderly revelation. The capacity for opposites to coexist comes only from the transcendent dimension of godliness. Again, it's not sophisticated. In an orderly world, in orderly revelation, only one thing can happen at a time. There can only be one thing, either the good or getting rid of the negative, right? Before, he uses the analogy, before the king comes into the house, you got to get rid of all the schmutz. You got to get rid of all the stuff. You got to clean it up. Kings don't go into places where there's dirtiness. Clean out the dirtiness, then the king can come in, right? So for this revelation to take place, it has to come from a dimension of godliness that can contain both dimensions, both eradicating the evil and embracing the holiness and the good. That's the encompassing light. And since the revelation is from such a high place, this transcendent dimension, so therefore the holiday is celebrated in the same fashion, where in the very same day that the miracle occurred, we're also celebrating the Exodus. Just like the light is a transcendent, all-encompassing light, so too the experience, the miracle, is celebrated in a transcendent, unifying fashion. So that answers the question of the discourse. That makes sense? Any questions or comments on that? As my child would say, crickets. Is that a good sign? I'm going to take it as a good sign. It's because it's Passover, so we're going to go positive. Good. Okay. So, however, we have a question. And let's go to chapter 2, which is on page 15. So the balance of today's class is going to be asking this question and answering the question. Now that will actually close out this discourse. Let's take a moment to elaborate a little bit more on what we mean by this transcendent light. You know, there's a world of therapy today called IFS. Anybody heard of it? Internal Family Systems. So it's very fascinating. It's become very popular, and the premise of it is that we have different parts of our being. Have anybody heard of the concept of a shadow self? It's also becoming popular. But it's all repackaging of core ideas, and many of these ideas are found in Hasidic teachings. But so you're a child, and somebody says something, does something that we call it big T trauma, little T trauma, right? For whatever reason, it affected you. We all have those stories. Your father said something, your mother said something, your great-grandmother, a neighbor said something, and for whatever reason, you internalized it in a certain way, right? And now that is your perspective about the world. So your wife or your husband says something to you, and immediately that part of your being goes to protect you. Or you experience something, you read something in the news and you get triggered from it, or a coworker says something, or the bank does something, or you get a telephone bill or an electric bill that's, right? Just think about the last time you got agitated about something, right? Something's agitating you. It's someone, it's something, it's some experience. What's going on inside of you is that you have some story about that experience. And because it's very painful to go back to that core of what it is that you experienced in that moment, so your system, your emotional system, built something called a protector. And the protector is like a guard. And it says, we're not gonna feel that. We're not gonna be conscious of that feeling. So therefore, you did this to me, you said that to me, I'm gonna lash out at you. Because if I push it on you, or if I express it externally, I don't have to look at that discomfort within myself. Right? This is not sophisticated. Each of us have that experience. Think about something that rankles you, someone, so and your reaction is to put up your guard. And we have many parts. We have a lot of these protectors within ourselves because we have a lot of experiences. Some have more, some have less. But when you see somebody who is always on a short fuse, you can imagine that they went through something very difficult or multiple difficult experiences, that their internal systems are really, really complex, really confused, and they have a lot of protectors up. So instead of like looking at what is inside of themselves and what is the internal experience, they're constantly putting up shields. Those shields look like anger, they look like lashing out, they look like addictions, they look like overeating, they look like shutting down. There are all kinds of different ways we do that, right? But at our core, at our deepest core, what we call self, there everything's good. The problem is we don't go to self. Because to go to self means to have to navigate through all of those difficult experiences. But if you can imagine being in self, and we also occasionally do find ourselves there when we're in a good place and somebody does that thing or says that thing that triggers us, and we're truly in an authentically within self, then we don't have to lash out at that person. And we don't even have to be judgmental of that person. We can just really be at peace and say, look, I'm sorry that you feel that way, but I'm actually okay. Like, I'm okay with myself, right? And the deeper we can go into self, what actually happens, and this is the punchline, what actually happens in the deepest dimension of self is that all of that stuff, all of that external dichotomy can coexist within self. In our core, we don't have a problem with anything in the world. I'm not saying that objectively we say that that's right and that's wrong, but we don't get rankled by it because we're anchored in something that is transcendent, right? All of those experiences are not transcendent. They're immanent, they're engaged. When we go to core, we go to self, then we can transcend all of that. Again, I'd love to get some feedback if this is resonating. Yeah, this speaks to you? But I'll give you two other kind of parallels that some of you may be familiar with. Well, it's actually one. It's altered states of consciousness, right? Altered states of consciousness can come about through alcohol, through psychedelics, through meditation. There's all these different altered states of consciousness. What happens in an altered state of consciousness? It's not about the brain. We call it an altered state of consciousness, but an altered state of consciousness actually means that your brain gets out of the way and allows for you to be connected to your core. And in that state of in that core state, all that stuff that's on the outside that creates tension in our lives dissipates. Not because it goes away, but because we are in a state of being that transcends all of that. An example of this, actually, a beautiful example of this, which is often repeated in Hasidic discourses, is a person who's making a wedding for their only child, right? They're in the middle of making this wedding for their only child, and their enemy shows up to the wedding, uninvited. Because they are on such a different dimension, they're in a place of self, right? Joy and celebrating this profound celebration, they have space to tolerate their enemy who showed up to their kid's wedding, right? Or another example is Yom Kippur, right? When we're in this kind of heightened state of divine connection, even if it doesn't necessarily last, in the moment, there's a thought that says, oh, that guy that's really been on my nerves, I'm going to forgive him. What happened 12 hours earlier? 12 hours earlier, you weren't in that state of self. So therefore, you couldn't tolerate him. But now that you're in your true state of self, you can tolerate that person. The hope is that when Yom Kippur ends and you're back into your external dimensions, that you can still figure out how to navigate that. So this is all really the dimension of what we call this Soiviv Kolam, this encompassing light of God, is this transcendent light. And he quotes the verse from Job, from Eov. Job, in one of his conversations with God, he says that if you'll act righteously, what does it give to him? And if you do abundant sin, what's it going to do to him? Like, in other words, when we do good, does it really affect God? When we do bad, does it affect God? There is a dimension of God, so to speak, in this place of self, right? If we can mirror anthropomorphically what we experience in self, and we project that, so to speak, in a dimension of God, there's a dimension of God that's also transcendent, that has tolerance for good and evil, that good and evil are all one, like it's all good, right? You imagine that person who's high, right? If you've encountered such people, right? It's all good. Everything's good. It's all good. Good is good, bad is good, it's all good. By the way, we were also talking about this yesterday, that, both these terrorists on October 7th, but apparently this is common practice in many countries. I mean, not to equate the terrorists with proper armies, where when they have to fight war, they drug them up. They give them various different types of drugs so that number one, they don't experience the horrors that they're engaged in. Right, the battle of war is terrible. Right, you see death and you don't internalize it, but also so that you can be able to do what you need to do. Right, so that's you're in a different state of consciousness where it doesn't hurt as bad. In a normal state of consciousness, like, how do you hurt another person? And by the way, when I say hurt another person, like, how do we even emotionally hurt another person? It's because we're not in self. We're in some external dimension of ourselves. We're stuck in some external part of ourselves that we can say something hurtful to a spouse or to a child or to a parent. That's not who we really are. It's an external dimension. So taking this to God, there's a dimension of God that transcends all of that stuff. And therefore, it's not just that God is tolerant. This stuff coexists. Now, we don't generally relate to God in that dimension. We relate to God in an engaged dimension. We relate to God as he's in Mamali Kalam, and as he fills the world on this personal relationship. So therefore, their things are very orderly. And fundamentally, as we're going to talk in a minute, our good deeds do have an effect on God, as do our negative deeds. But the question that the Alter Rebbe has now is, if the revelation is coming from this dimension that transcends good and evil, so how is it indeed that in the same moment that God is meting out punishment, that he's saving the good? In other words, how is God discerning between the good and the evil if they're all the same in this dimension, in this dimension of transcendent revelation? Let's read it in the text. If this light is both, it equalizes, it's everything is equal before it, and it equalizes everything. And before him, darkness is like light. Or v'im tzadakta, he quotes these different verses that if you do righteousness, what does that give to him? So then, then how is it possible that from that very same level where God's love is manifest, that it's specifically from there that the punishment, the striking down of the Egyptian firstborns takes place? In other words, if there's this revelation that's taking place it should be just as revealed to the Egyptians as it is to the Jews. And yet we see that the revelation actually took out the Egyptians and preserved the Jews. Understand the question? It's a very subtle but very powerful question in the understanding of what this encompassing light is all about. It's like saying I'm in self, but I'm actually making a distinction between one thing and the other. Well, if you're truly in self, you're not going to make that distinction. So the answer is according to that which is taught in the Pri Eitz Chaim. The Pirish Avadim Hayinu Vayesenu Hashem Elokeinu. In the Haggadah, the beginning of the Haggadah, the beginning of the main section of the Haggadah, we say we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and Hashem Elokeinu took us out of Egypt. What is Hashem and Elokeinu? Hashem and Elokeinu represent Abba ve'Ima shel bishu l'zrayis ta'arach anpin. It represents father, which is Chachma, and Ima, which is mother, understanding, as they become internalized in themselves, the arms, which is the attributes of kindness and severity of Arach Anpin, Hashem's will. Let me explain what this means. When we talk about the subconscious in its core, the subconscious is both all-encompassing and also distinctive at the same time. What is my inner will? Let's talk about will first. We have an inner will and an outer will. Our inner will is to do good, is to be connected. Our outer will can sometimes contradict our inner will, as all of us experience every single day. We do things externally that are not necessarily aligned with our inner will. So, why is that the case? How is it possible that we can do things externally that are not consistent with our inner will? That's because in those moments, our inner will is in a subconscious state. What we really want is subconscious in the moment. In other words, in our subconscious, as it is for itself, we can tolerate good and evil, as is evident, right? There are times, sometimes we do something, we say, oh shoot, why did I do that? Why did I do that? I did it yesterday, and I promised myself I wasn't going to do it again. I thought about it, and I understood that this isn't healthy behavior and this is not good. Why did I do it again? Because in the moment that your outer will wanted to do it, whatever it was, would think it, speak it, do it, your inner will was in its subconscious state and it wasn't awake. If your inner will is in a conscious state, then there's discernment. Let me say this again, probably in the same words or maybe in a few different words, but just to emphasize the point. We have an inner will and an outer will. When we've shed, like all the public opinion, I mentioned this a few weeks ago in a class. What does he call it? He calls it the image company. There's this Hasidic singer. He has something called the image company. He says, we all work for the image company, right? How many times a day are we working for the image company, making sure that our image is showing up to the world in the way we want it to look, right? When the image company is closed down and we're just having an honest, authentic, vulnerable conversation, We're not worried about what you think about me and how you think about me and how I think about you and so on. When we're operating on that level, we know what's right, we know what's wrong. We want to live consistent with our inner will. The problem is that we don't stay in that space. So that inner will moves into its subconscious state. And when that inner will moves into its subconscious state, what's left is the outer will. And the outer will sometimes gets it right, and oftentimes it doesn't. So when the person's willpower is in a subconscious state, then there is space. Then it tolerates and embraces both good and evil. In its subconscious state, it has space for good and evil. But when the inner will is manifest, in other words, when that subconscious becomes conscious, then it already creates discernment. And the good lands were the good lands, and the evil lands were the evil lands. So in God's essence, in God's subconscious, to use this terminology, God's will has space for everything. But when that will becomes manifest, then it begins to create its discernment. And in Egypt, when God's inner will became manifest, the discernment between the Jewish people and the Egyptians, between good and evil, became manifest. Let's read it in the words. There's a term, oisios machkimois, that letters make one wise. Let's read it with the words, and let's see if we all understand this.
The thing that being created in God's image, we have the ability to do the same.
Yes, that's one of the powerful takeaways, is to realize we have the ability to release our core, to access our core. Very difficult. That's why people oftentimes get there through utilizing external forces, substances, because we want to be there. It feels very good to be there, but it's very difficult to get there on our own. And it's not, and ultimately, it's not a state of being that we can be in on a regular basis. We have to touch it every now and then. That's why Pesach is only 8 days, right? We have these experiences. So let's explain for a moment that Hashem and Elokeinu, right? In the Haggadah it says, "In God, we were slaves to Pharaoh, and Hashem Elokeinu took us out." Hashem represents the level of Chachma. That's the first of the 10 Sephiros. That's the genesis of an idea. Elokeinu represents Bina, understanding. That's the development of the idea. If you look at the chart on 16, it's only in Hebrew, but if you look at the top of I'll kind of break it down for you. You have the within the big box, you have the top section. If you want to write it down, you got three words and then one word. That section, that's called the encompassing light. That's the inner will of God. In the inner will of God, you have kindness and severity. You have the discernment. But in the inner will of God, they're all merged together. But they're there, right? The fact that we say that in God's essence, he tolerates good and evil, that means that they exist as a concept, but there's tolerance for both of them. God accepts both of them. He doesn't create discernment between them. That's the second section. Then, in the third section, there's one word on top of one word. That is God as he becomes present. God as he fills the world. And there, you see on the bottom box, Chachma and Bina, wisdom and understanding. That's where the intellect now creates a conscious state of discernment. So what is he saying here? So on page 18, Pirish, this means as follows. The Jewish people originate in God's inner will. Like it says, Ya'er Hashem panav elecha. May Hashem shine his panim, his face. The word for face, panim, is pnimius. Why do we say the face, the eyes are a window to the soul? Because the face represents the inner dimension, right? You can't tell from my back what kind of mood I'm in, but you can oftentimes tell from my face what kind of mood I'm in, right? Because the face reflects the inner dimension. So when the verse says God should shine his countenance, his face to you, that is God saying that the Jewish people are an expression of God's inner dimension. Now, where does Egypt come from? Mitzrayim, Sharshim, B'chinas Acharayim, Oiref. The Egyptians, their spiritual source is the backside, the neck. In Hebrew, a neck is oref. And if you look at the letters, oref and paro, Pharaoh, have the same letters. So Pharaoh represents the neck. It represents the backside. What does the backside mean? The backside means not the inner will, the external will. What does that mean? That means that God has an inner will. What's God's inner will? God's inner will is that godliness should pervade. There should be a consciousness of the divine, right? That truth should reign. That purity should be the call of the hour. But in order for that to be of any meaning, there has to be concealment. There has to be discernment, right? Light is not light unless there's darkness. Good is not good unless we're contrasting against evil. The face is only a face because there's a neck, because there's a back. So, whereas the Jewish people represent God's inner dimension, Pharaoh represents the neck, the backside. And in practice, that means any of the challenges, the negativity that we encounter in this world, that represents the outer will of God, the necessary outer will of God, so that we can connect with God in an inner dimension. But we have to discern, we have to get through the darkness to get to the light. We have to we have to define and discern the negative from the positive. Now, so if we remember the story, the Jewish people came down, first Joseph came down to Egypt, and then the brothers and Jacob came down, and they were there until the Torah tells us that Pharaoh died, and a new Pharaoh, a new king came along. The brothers, as long as the brothers were alive, the slavery didn't begin. Why? Because they were righteous. And the nature of righteous people is that they reflect the inner dimension. If you've ever met a righteous person, right? When we talk about good people, right? What do we mean when we say, oh, they're such a good person? We mean that the inside is more exposed than the outside. We're in touch with, you can see inside them. You can see the refinedness. You see some element of the soul. So the brothers were righteous, and as long as they were alive, there wasn't a dominance for the negativity of Egypt. The Jews were plugged in. They saw the light. When the brothers died, now the concealment set in. In other words, now the external dimension took a dominance. By the way, you see this also in the evolution of the human being, right? When we're younger, we have a lot of idealism. What is idealism? Idealism breaks through the external dimensions. We don't buy into the facade. We don't buy into the concealment. And that works for a while until life deals you such a blow that you give up your idealism, which most people experience at some point. What does it mean you give up your idealism? You realize that we start buying into the concealment that it's actually real, or at least that it's real enough that we have to engage with it. In other words, idealism is a little bit fantasy. It's good, it's important, but it's a little fantastical because you don't live life in that space. The world doesn't work in the place of idealism. Life is lived in the concealment. What the idealism does is it allows us to never fully buy into the concealment. Like if we were once idealistic, then we can always look at the concealment and say, I can get through this. I know that there's light inside of there. I know there's goodness inside, right? A good therapist never stops believing in their client. I know there's good inside of you. I don't know how we're going to get there, but we're going to work it. We're going to find our way in there, right? A parent never gives up on their child. I know there's good in there. I don't know how we're going to get there. There's a lot of darkness right now. There's a lot of concealment. But we'll push through and get to the light, right? That's our capacity. So when Joseph dies and all of the brothers, the concealment sets in. When the concealment sets in, then the concealment becomes the dominant. So what happens then is that the spiritual flow that is received comes from a backhanded manner. Let me explain what that means. God needs the concealment because in order for us to find God, we have to come through the darkness. But that's not what God really wants. That's not his objective. His objective is not the darkness. His objective is the light that we'll find through going through the darkness. So nobody pays their electric bill or their sanitation bill with a party, right? Oh, it's time to pay the electric bill. Like we're so excited to do this. No, because we don't like paying the electric bill for the sake of paying the electric bill. We're grateful to have electric because when we have electric, then we can sit together as a family and we can talk and we can use our computer and enjoy the lights. But the bill is something necessary, or I prefer to use the analogy of changing your child's diaper, right? Nobody loves that as an objective. I can't wait to change the next diaper. That's just not something people are excited about. But it's something you do. You do it. You plug your nose and you do it because you want to have this healthy human being. So God wants the darkness insofar as it will empower us to be able to work through it to find the light. But because it's not what God wants, it's not his primary interest. So the flow that comes to the concealment comes in a backhanded manner, like one who's throwing something over his shoulder. And again, the backhanded represents the idea of the concealment. The energy of the concealment is a backhanded. It's not coming from God's inner will. And that's what happened is we became slaves to Pharaoh. We became slaves to the neck. We became slaves to the backhanded side. We became slaves to the backhanded flow. Think about it. This is so real, right? How do we spend most of our time? Most of our time is spent in concealment. How many hours a day, with the exclusion of a few professions that maybe are the whole profession is about helping people, maybe doctors or maybe rabbis, or spiritual leaders and maybe therapists, whatever. But you could be doing wonderful things in the world. You can have a fantastic AI tech company, but you're a slave to the objective, which is to produce something that's going to make money so that you can pay your bills. Why do you need to pay your bills? So you can live your life. What does it mean to live your life? Hopefully it means to live a life of meaning and connection, study Torah, do mitzvahs, connect with other people, bring godliness into the world. But when we buy the concealment, we become a slave to it. We become a slave to this external dimension of divine manifestation. That's what it means in the Haggadah. We were slaves to Pharaoh. We were slaves to the neck. But what happened afterwards? In other words, what happens? And by the way, all of that is when our inner will remains in the subconscious. Using our example before, that time that you said, oh, shoot, why did I do that again? Right? What happened? Whatever it was, that whatever the action was, in that moment was disconnected from its inner purpose. So we became a slave in that moment to the concealment. Instead of that action being plugged into its inner will, to its true subconscious state, in a conscious manner, in other words, that we actually processed it, instead of doing that, we were a slave to it. So it was disconnected. So how do we remedy that? How do we remedy that we shouldn't be in a position where we say, oh shoot, I did that again. How do we remedy that? We remedy that by bringing the subconscious into a state of consciousness. which is very difficult to do, granted, but bringing the subconscious into the state of consciousness is how we remedy it. Let me use psychological terms first. Viktor Frankl says, and I may not be quoting it correct, that between impulse and response is where choice lives. Right? Did I say that correctly? Right? Between impulse and response is where choice lives. What does that mean? Impulse is the subconscious operating, essentially, our will operating on a subconscious level. I'm getting triggered. I'm having a knee-jerk reaction. Something just happened that I have an impulsive movement inside of me. Now, whatever I'm going to do next, whatever next thought is, whatever next word I'm going to say, whatever next action, if I don't do anything between the impulse and that response, it's going to happen and it's not going to be healthy. So I have this pause here. I have this moment here. And in this moment is where I have the ability to change the outcome. What do I need to do in that moment? I need to stop and say to myself, what do I really want? What does the subconscious really want? Not what does the subconscious want as it's concealed? Because in that state, it has tolerance for good and evil. Right? At that level, it says, I don't care what you want. I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm going to do whatever I want. No, but what does the subconscious really want? If we extract the subconscious from its subconscious state and bring it into the chachma, into the bina, into the intellectual process, then we say, oh, what I really want is to choose good. What I really want is to be plugged in to my truest self. Then the next thought, the next word, the next action is going to be in alignment. And that's what it means, that after we were slaves to Pharaoh, after we were slaves to the backside, then God, Hashem Elokeinu, the Chachma and Bina, the intellectual process, brought us out. And in the context of Egypt, it means that God manifested himself moving from the subconscious state into the conscious state. And now once that's in the conscious state, even though it's rooted in a transcendent space, even though it's rooted in a transcendent space that has tolerance for good and evil, in its conscious state, it delineates between the inner and the outer, the inner will and the outer will, and says, I'm going to save the Jews and I'm going to smite the Egyptians. That the flow should come from God's inner countenance, and from there it becomes manifest for eternity. Even though, as we said, in the inner dimension, darkness is like light. In other words, there's no distinction. But the reality is that inner dimension has to become manifest through the flow of structure. It breaks through the structure, but it flows into the flow of structure. And in the flow of structure, it creates discernment. He references a teaching that when God first created the world, God removed his divine light to create space for existence. But then afterwards, God reintroduced, and so in that space, all that's left essentially is God's essence, God's infinite space, God's infinite light. But into that space, God reintroduced a line. A line, by definition, has a beginning and an end. It has a top and a bottom, meaning that even God's infinite light ultimately becomes expressed in some kind of structure. So it's a different manifestation than the structured light. It's the unstructured, it's the transcendent light that gets manifest, but ultimately gets manifest in some kind of structure, which therefore means that ultimately the subconscious dimension becomes manifest in a conscious state, and it creates discernment between the good and evil. On account of the fact that this encompassing light is in some manner internalized, as we mentioned, through the Chachma and the Bina, through the intellectual flow. So therefore, ultimately, it creates distinction between the Egyptians and the Jewish people, and in that very same moment, it both eliminates the Egyptians and creates redemption for the Jews. Okay, I know that was a very deep concept. I encourage everybody to take the booklet home read through the commentary, the English commentary, and I'm happy to continue later. I'm sorry? So yeah, please, and feel free to come back with questions. Again, I hope to see everybody next week at the new Kabbalah course, and that's it. Any questions, comments? I got some time if anybody has some thoughts that they want to share. Also okay to let everything gel. There's a lot to gel. One more thing is this Tuesday is the last day of Passover. There is a tradition that was introduced by the Baal Shem Tov to close out the holiday with a feast of Mashiach. We're going to be doing that. It'll start about 7 o'clock upstairs. If you're looking for a spiritual experience to internalize a lot of these teachings, it's a very profound experience. We sing some deep tunes that originate with many of the Hasidic masters. We'll share some of these ideas in very practical takeaway manner, and would love to have you all join us. So that'll be Tuesday at 7 o'clock upstairs. All right? Yeah.
I kind of heard the idea of like that everybody has exactly what they need. How do you sort of square that with the idea of like charity and also with the idea of greed?
Elaborate. What do you mean by that?
Like if everybody has exactly what they need and everybody has exactly what they're supposed to have, why should I give anything to anyone?
Great question.
Why should I criticize somebody for taking too much?
Great question. So I think this question was asked of Rabbi Akiva. And the question was, why didn't God make everybody equal? Right? In terms of their finances. So the answer was that God wanted to teach us the idea of giving to others. And therefore, for whatever reason, there are haves and have-nots. And our job is to live within that framework. So how do I need to look at, this is not a fatalistic view. The view is that I have what I need and God expects me to work, right? Because I can say I have what I need, I'm not going to work. God expects me to do what I need to do. So when someone is in need, there are a lot of very interesting framework for one who is what we would call poor, that needs to go, that takes money from others. There's a framework for that. It's that they've tried to make a living on their own, and they can't, and they have responsibilities to provide. But it's not like someone who's poor can suddenly say, okay, hey, give me $1 million, right? It's to cover their needs. There's a poverty line within Jewish practice, and they're allowed to get them through the poverty line. But it's to provide for their needs, not just to stock up bank accounts. And that's their responsibility within the framework of what God wants from them, is to live within the structure that He's created for them. So when we say everybody has what they need, we don't only mean material. We mean also attitude, structure, perspectives. We have the capacity, if somebody is poor, their need that God structured for them is to require assistance from others. Conversely, the wealthy person or the person with money has to look at what they have and say, I have what I need. Why did God give me all of this? What am I supposed to do with it? And what I'm supposed to do with it is help others. Now, how much do you help others? Again, there's a structure to that. There's you tithe, you give a fifth of your possessions, of your income, whatever. It's not a fait accompli. Oh, everybody has what they need, and therefore they don't have to do anything. The opposite is true. Everybody has what they need in order for them to then do what they are supposed to do on this earth. Some of that might be helping others. Some of that might be developing ourselves. Some might, et cetera, et cetera.
That's something that they need, that sort of inner outer will.
Correct. Correct. And we turn to Torah to teach us, because sometimes we can get very subjective in what I need and what my purpose is here. And we turn to Torah to say, okay, give me guidance here. Like, where am I supposed to be manifesting that need, and where am I supposed to be spending my efforts, and so on. You're welcome. All right. You're welcome. Tell me your name, please.